When they called Joe Walker just a janitor and dared him to teach their spoiled kids karate as a cruel joke, they had no idea they were about to witness something that would shake their privileged world to its core. What happened next didn't just shock the school, it changed lives forever. Stay with me until the end of this incredible journey, and don't forget to comment below what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story has traveled across the world. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal dirge above Joe Walker's head as he pushed his mop bucket down the polished hallway of Westfield Martial Arts Academy. Each squeak of the wheels echoed like a metronome, counting down the hours until he could collect his daughter and go home to their cramped one-bedroom apartment. The smell of disinfectant had long since stopped bothering him. It was the scent of survival, of keeping food on the table and a roof over 8-year-old Lila's head. Through the frosted glass doors of Studio A, he could hear the sharp commands of Coach Marcus Mason, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Focus. Discipline, perfection. The man's words carried the weight of someone who had never known what it meant to scrub toilets at 2 a.m. or count quarters for grocery money. Joe paused his mopping to glance through the window. Inside, a dozen kids in pristine white uniforms practiced their forms, their movements crisp and confident. These weren't the children from his neighborhood. These were the offspring of lawyers and doctors, investment bankers, and tech executives. Their monthly tuition fees probably cost more than Joe made in 3 months of cleaning every surface in this building. "Daddy, can I watch?" The small voice behind him made Joe's heart skip. He turned to see Lila approaching with her backpack slung over one shoulder, her school uniform wrinkled from another long day at Lincoln Elementary. Her dark eyes, so much like her mother's, were fixed on the martial arts class with an intensity that made Joe's chest tighten. "Hey, baby girl," he said softly, setting down his mop. "You're early today." "Mrs. Patterson let us out 10 minutes before the bell," Lila explained, but her attention had already drifted back to the students inside. "Look how they move, Daddy. It's like dancing, but stronger." Joe followed her gaze and watched as a boy about Lila's age executed a perfect front kick, his face serious with concentration. The kid's uniform was spotless, his belt tied with military precision. Everything about him screamed privilege and opportunity, 2 things Joe couldn't give his daughter, no matter how many floors he mopped or how many trash cans he emptied. "It's beautiful," Lila whispered, pressing her small hands against the glass. Do you think I could ever learn to do that?" The question hit Joe like a physical blow. He knelt down beside his daughter, his janitor's uniform suddenly feeling heavier than usual. "Lila, sweetheart, classes like this, they cost a lot of money." "I know," she said quickly, her voice small but determined. "But maybe I could just watch. Sometimes I won't be in the way, I promise." Before Joe could answer, the studio door burst open and Coach Mason emerged, his face flushed with irritation. At 35, Mason was all sharp angles and barely contained aggression, the kind of man who wore his black belt like a crown and his authority like armor. "Walker," Mason's voice cracked like a whip. "What did I tell you about bringing your kid around during class hours?" Joe stood slowly, instinctively positioning himself between Mason and Lila. "She's not causing any trouble, Coach. We were just what, loitering? This is a professional training facility, not a daycare center." Mason's eyes flicked dismissively to Lila, who had shrunk back behind her father's legs. "These students pay premium prices for premium instruction. They don't need distractions." She was only looking through the window. Joe said, his voice carefully controlled. Years of swallowing his pride had taught him when to pick his battles. "We'll move along." But Lila stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance that reminded Joe painfully of her mother. I wasn't being a distraction, she said, her voice trembling but clear. I was just watching, because it's beautiful, and I want to learn. Mason laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that made several students inside the studio turn to look. You want to learn, kid? Do you have any idea what it costs to train here? What kind of commitment it requires? Marcus. The voice was soft, but carried absolute authority. Joe turned to see Naomi Sinclair approaching from the main office, her heels clicking against the polished floor with measured precision. At 42, the Academy's director moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades mastering the art of balance, both physical and emotional. Naomi's silver-streaked hair was pulled back in an elegant bun, and her business attire couldn't quite hide the lean muscle of someone who had earned her credentials the hard way. But it was her eyes that commanded attention, dark brown and intelligent, with a depth that suggested she saw far more than most people realized. Mrs. Sinclair, Mason said, his tone shifting to something approaching respect. I was just explaining to Walker here about our policies regarding— I heard what you were explaining, Naomi interrupted smoothly. She looked down at Lila with genuine interest. And what's your name, young lady? Lila Walker, the girl replied, straightening her shoulders. I'm 8 years old, and I really want to learn martial arts. Really. Naomi's lips curved in a small smile. That's quite a lot of wanting. Tell me, Lila, what is it about martial arts that interests you? Lila glanced up at her father, who nodded encouragingly. It looks like the people inside are learning how to be strong, she said carefully. Not just with their bodies, but with their minds too. Like they're becoming the best versions of themselves. The hallway fell silent except for the distant sounds of training from the studio. Joe watched as something shifted in Naomi's expression, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, or surprise. Even Mason seemed momentarily at a loss for words. That's a very mature observation, Naomi said finally. Most adults don't understand that distinction. My daddy taught me about being strong in different ways. Lila continued, warming to the topic. He says that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is keep going when everything feels impossible. Joe felt heat rise in his cheeks. He glanced at Naomi expecting to see pity or condescension, but instead found something that looked almost like respect. Your daddy sounds like a wise man, Naomi said. Then she looked directly at Joe. Mr. Walker, isn't it? You've been working here for 6 months now. 7, ma'am. Joe replied, surprised she knew his name at all. To most of the staff and students, he was invisible, just another piece of maintenance equipment that kept the building running. 7 months, Naomi repeated thoughtfully. And in all that time, you've never missed a shift, never left a job half-finished, and never complained about working around our schedule. Mrs. Chen in accounting speaks very highly of your reliability. Mason shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Sinclair, while I'm sure Walker is a fine employee, we really should discuss the matter of unauthorized personnel during— Marcus! Naomi's voice carried a warning that made the coach close his mouth immediately. I'd like to speak with Mr. Walker and his daughter privately. Please return to your class. For a moment, Mason looked like he wanted to argue. Then he glanced at the students watching through the studio window and forced a tight smile. Of course, but I do hope we can resolve this matter quickly. My students are preparing for the regional tournament, and they need focused instruction. As Mason retreated into the studio, Naomi turned her full attention to Joe and Lila. Mr. Walker, would you mind if I asked you a few questions? Joe nodded, unsure where this was heading, but grateful that his daughter wasn't being dismissed outright. Have you ever studied martial arts? Naomi asked. The question caught Joe off guard. He glanced down at Lila, then back at Naomi. A long time ago, he said quietly. Before life got complicated. What style? Shotokan karate primarily. Some judo. I trained for about 12 years from when I was 10 until I was 22. The words felt strange in his mouth, like speaking a foreign language he hadn't used in years. 12 years. Naomi repeated, her eyebrows rising slightly. That's serious commitment. What rank did you achieve? Joe hesitated. This was dangerous territory. Talking about his past meant risking questions he wasn't ready to answer. Second-degree black belt in karate, brown belt in judo. And you stopped training because life happened, Joe said simply. Lila's mother got sick, medical bills, hospital stays. There wasn't time or money for training. After she passed, it was just about survival, keeping a roof over our heads, food on the table. The honesty in his voice seemed to affect Naomi more than he expected. She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with those perceptive eyes. I'm sorry for your loss, she said finally. That must have been incredibly difficult. Joe nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Beside him, Lila reached up and took his hand, squeezing it gently. Even at 8 years old, she seemed to understand that some conversations required extra courage. Mr. Walker? Naomi continued. I have a proposition for you. It's unconventional, but then again, some of the best solutions are. Before she could elaborate, the studio door opened again, and Mason emerged, his face twisted with irritation. Mrs. Sinclair, I really must insist. Marcus! Naomi's voice cut through his protest like a blade. Actually, your timing is perfect. I was just about to discuss something that concerns your class. Mason's expression shifted to wariness. What kind of something? Naomi smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both warm and predatory. Mr. Walker here has just informed me that he holds a second-degree black belt in karate and a brown belt in judo. 12 years of training. The color drained from Mason's face. He looked from Naomi to Joe, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. That's impossible. He's a janitor. He's a janitor who happens to have extensive martial arts training, Naomi corrected smoothly. Which brings me to my proposition. Marcus, you've been complaining about the workload, about having 30 students in your advanced class. You've requested an assistant instructor multiple times. Yes, but I meant someone with proper credentials, someone from a recognized dojo, someone with a second-degree black belt and 12 years of experience. Naomi's smile widened. Someone who clearly understands discipline and hard work. Someone who's been observing our methods for 7 months and knows exactly how this academy operates. Joe felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Mrs. Sinclair, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm not qualified to teach these kids. I haven't trained in years, and they're used to a certain level of instruction. Daddy, Lila whispered, tugging on his sleeve. Maybe this is your chance to be strong in a different way. The words hit Joe like a lightning bolt. He looked down at his daughter, seeing his own dreams reflected in her hopeful eyes, and felt something stir in his chest, something he'd thought was dead and buried with his wife. Mr. Walker, Naomi said gently, I'm not asking you to take over the program. I'm asking you to assist, to share your knowledge and experience with students who could benefit from a different perspective. And in return, she glanced meaningfully at Lila. Perhaps we could arrange for your daughter to participate in our youth program. Full scholarship, of course. The offer hung in the air like a perfectly balanced blade. Joe could feel Mason's hostile stare, could sense the weight of opportunity and risk pressing down on his shoulders. This was the kind of chance that came once in a lifetime, the kind that could change everything. or destroy what little stability he'd managed to build. "I don't know," Joe said slowly. "These kids, they come from a different world than Lila and me. Their parents expect excellence, professionalism. What if I can't deliver?" "What if you can?" Naomi countered. "Mr. Walker, I've been running this academy for 8 years. I've seen plenty of instructors come and go, some with impressive credentials and inflated egos, others with genuine skill and humble hearts. You know what I've learned? The best teachers aren't always the ones with the most trophies on their walls. They're the ones who understand that martial arts isn't about perfection. It's about growth, perseverance, and finding strength you didn't know you had." Mason stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "Mrs. Sinclair, this is completely inappropriate. These students have been training with me for years. They trust my methods, my expertise. You can't just bring in some amateur and expect—" "Some amateur?" Naomi's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Marcus, may I remind you that you hold a first-degree black belt with 6 years of training. Mr. Walker has 12 years and a higher rank. Technically speaking, he outranks you." The words landed like a physical blow. Mason's face went through several shades of red before settling on a mottled purple. "Rank isn't everything," he sputtered. "There's teaching experience, pedagogical training, understanding of child development. All of which can be learned," Naomi interrupted. "What can't be learned is heart dedication and the kind of quiet strength that comes from overcoming real adversity. Mr. Walker has been showing up here every day for 7 months, working around our schedule, respecting our space, and doing his job with dignity and professionalism. Those are exactly the qualities I want my students to see." Joe felt the weight of every eye in the hallway. Through the studio window, he could see some of the students had stopped their practice to watch the drama unfolding outside. Their faces were curious, expectant, waiting to see what the janitor would do when handed the impossible. "I need time to think about this," Joe said finally. It's a lot to process." "Of course," Naomi nodded. "Take all the time you need. But Mr. Walker—" She paused, meeting his eyes directly. "Sometimes the biggest risk is not taking any risk at all." As if on cue, the studio door opened, and a young boy about Lila's age emerged, his pristine white uniform marking him as one of the beginner students. Joe recognized him, Trevor Chen, son of Dr. Richard Chen, the orthopedic surgeon who drove the silver BMW and always seemed to be on his phone. "Mom says I need to use the bathroom," Trevor announced, then stopped short when he saw the group in the hallway. His eyes widened as he took in Joe's janitor uniform and Lila's hand-me-down clothes. "Trevor," Mason said quickly, "go ahead to the restroom. We'll resume class in a moment." But Trevor was staring at Lila with undisguised curiosity. "Are you starting classes here?" he asked. Lila glanced up at her father before answering. "Maybe," she said quietly. "I'd really like to learn." "Cool," Trevor said, with the easy acceptance of childhood. "I just started last month. It's really fun, but kinda hard too. Coach Mason says I need to work on my kicks." "What's your favorite part so far?" Lila asked, her shyness forgotten in the face of genuine interest. "The forms," Trevor replied immediately. "They're like dance, but more powerful. Want me to show you one?" Before anyone could object, Trevor dropped into a ready stance and began executing a basic kata. His movements were enthusiastic, if not entirely precise, but Joe could see the foundation of good technique beginning to take shape. More importantly, he could see the joy on the boy's face, the pure pleasure of movement and accomplishment. When Trevor finished, Lila clapped enthusiastically. "That was amazing. You looked so focused and strong." "Thanks," Trevor beamed. Maybe we could be training partners if you start classes. It's always more fun with friends." The innocent exchange seemed to shift something in the atmosphere. Joe watched his daughter's face light up with possibility, saw the easy friendship forming between two children who should have been worlds apart. Maybe social barriers didn't matter as much as he'd thought. Maybe what mattered was finding common ground in the pursuit of something greater than yourself. "Trevor," Mason said sharply, "you really should use the restroom and get back to class. Your father is paying for focused instruction, not social hour." The boy's smile faded slightly, but he nodded obediently. "Okay, Coach Mason. See you later, Lila." As Trevor disappeared down the hallway, Joe felt Naomi's eyes on him again. "That boy has been struggling with confidence issues," she said quietly. "His parents push him hard, maybe too hard. But just now, talking to your daughter, he seemed lighter somehow." "Lila has that effect on people," Joe admitted. "She sees the good in everything." "She gets that from her father, I think," Naomi observed. "Mr. Walker, I meant what I said about taking time to consider my offer. But I should mention that we have a trial class scheduled for this Saturday morning, new students' parents observing that sort of thing. If you wanted to see how our program works from the inside." She let the invitation hang in the air, unfinished but clear. Joe could feel Lila's hopeful energy radiating beside him like a small sun. "What would I have to do?" he asked, the words coming out before he could stop them. "Just assist," Naomi said simply. "Help with basic techniques, offer encouragement, share your perspective when appropriate. Nothing you're not comfortable with." Mason opened his mouth to object, but Naomi silenced him with a look that could have frozen fire. "And Lila," Joe asked, "would participate in the trial class, of course. No charge, no commitment beyond Saturday morning. Just a chance for both of you to see if this feels right." Joe looked down at his daughter, seeing hope and trust warring with apprehension in her dark eyes. He thought about the long nights ahead, the endless cycle of cleaning and working, and barely getting by. He thought about the dreams he'd buried when life got too heavy to carry them. And he thought about what his wife would have said if she were here, Sarah, who had always believed that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. "Saturday morning," he said finally. "We'll try Saturday morning." The smile that spread across Lila's face was worth every risk, every uncertainty, every potential heartbreak that lay ahead. She threw her arms around his waist, hugging him tight enough to crack ribs. "Thank you, Daddy," she whispered against his uniform shirt. "Thank you for being brave." As they walked away down the hallway, Joe pushing his mop bucket, Lila skipping beside him, neither of them saw the calculating look that passed between Naomi and Mason, or the way the other students pressed against the studio windows to watch them go. What Joe Walker didn't know was that Saturday morning would change everything, not just for him and Lila, but for every person whose life would be touched by what was about to unfold. He didn't know that he was about to walk into a room full of privileged children and their skeptical parents armed with nothing but forgotten skills and a father's desperate love. He didn't know that some of those parents would see him as exactly what he appeared to be, a janitor, with delusions of grandeur, a charity case who didn't belong in their rarefied world. He didn't know that his first real test wouldn't come from the students, but from the adults who would watch his every move waiting for him to fail. And he definitely didn't know that before the morning was over, he would find himself face to face with a challenge that would force him to choose between safety and authenticity, between hiding in the shadows and stepping into the light. But as they reached the end of the hallway, and Joe caught sight of their reflection in the glass doors, a father and daughter walking toward an uncertain future, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the desperate, clinging kind that fears disappointment, but the quiet, steady kind that whispers, maybe, just maybe, this time could be different. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, counting down the hours until Saturday morning, when Joe Walker would discover that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with fists, but with the courage to believe in yourself when no one else will. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made promises feel possible. Joe stood in the Academy's parking lot at 7:30, watching luxury cars discharge their precious cargo children in spotless uniforms, followed by parents whose weekend casual wear probably cost more than his monthly rent. His own reflection in the glass doors showed a man trying to bridge two worlds, clean jeans and a polo shirt that Lila had helped him pick out, borrowed from the small wardrobe he'd assembled for parent-teacher conferences and job interviews. "Daddy, my stomach feels funny," Lila whispered, clutching his hand as they approached the entrance. She wore the beginner's uniform Naomi had provided, a simple white gilet that hung slightly loose on her small frame. The white belt tied with the careful precision Joe had taught her the night before. "Mine too, baby girl," Joe admitted, squeezing her fingers gently. "But sometimes the best things happen when we're a little scared." Inside, the Academy hummed with nervous energy. Parents clustered in small groups, their conversations a mixture of scheduling logistics and subtle competitive assessment. Joe recognized the dynamic immediately. These were people accustomed to excellence, to having their expectations met and exceeded. They weren't here for participation trophies or feel-good moments. They were investing in their children's futures with the same calculating precision they brought to their careers. "Mr. Walker." Naomi's voice cut through the morning bustle like a warm beacon. She approached with the fluid confidence of someone completely in her element. Her training clothes somehow managing to look both professional and approachable. "I'm so glad you decided to join us." "We're here," Joe said simply, though his eyes swept the room with the cautious assessment of someone who had learned to read social dynamics for survival. "Where would you like us?" "Let me introduce you to some of our parents first," Naomi said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Building trust starts with transparency." She guided them toward a group of adults near the observation area where floor-to-ceiling windows provided a clear view of the main training space. Joe recognized several faces from his evening cleaning rounds: Dr. Chen, whose son Trevor had befriended Lila; Margaret Holloway, the family court judge, whose daughter Emma was one of the Academy's most dedicated students; and Robert Steinberg, the investment banker, whose twin boys were known for their competitive intensity. "Everyone I'd like you to meet, Joe Walker and his daughter Lila," Naomi announced with practiced ease. "Joe will be assisting with today's trial class, and Lila will be participating as a new student." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds too long. Joe watched the parents' expressions shift from polite interest to carefully concealed confusion as they processed his appearance, his obvious blue-collar background, and the implications of Naomi's introduction. Dr. Chen recovered first, extending his hand with professional courtesy. "Richard Chen, my son Trevor mentioned meeting Lila yesterday." His grip was firm, but assessing the handshake of someone accustomed to making quick judgments about character. Trevor was quite excited about the possibility of a new training partner. "Lila's been looking forward to meeting him again," Joe replied, matching the doctor's professional tone while being acutely aware of how his calloused hands must feel against the surgeon's soft palms. Margaret Holloway stepped forward next, her judicial demeanor softened by genuine curiosity. "And you'll be assisting with instruction. What's your background in martial arts?" The question hung in the air like a challenge disguised as conversation. Joe could feel Lila's nervous energy beside him, could sense the weight of skeptical attention from every direction. 12 years of training, primarily Shotokan karate and judo," Joe said quietly. "Second-degree black belt, though it's been a while since I've taught." Robert Steinberg's eyebrows rose slightly. Second degree? That's fairly advanced. Where did you train? Joe hesitated, knowing that his answer would either validate or undermine everything Naomi was trying to accomplish. Kobayashi Dojo in Boston under Sensei James Kobayashi. He studied directly under Gichin Funakoshi's students in Japan. The name recognition was immediate and unmistakable. Dr. Chen's expression shifted from polite interest to genuine respect, while Margaret Holloway nodded with understanding. Even Steinberg looked impressed, despite himself. Kobayashi Dojo has an excellent reputation, Dr. Chen said slowly. Very traditional, very disciplined. Sensei Kobayashi trained several Olympic team members, if I recall correctly. He did. Joe confirmed, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders. I was never at that level, but I learned from some exceptional martial artists. And you stopped training because... Margaret's legal training made her naturally inclined to probe for complete stories. Joe glanced down at Lila, who was listening to every word with wide eyes. Life circumstances changed. My wife got sick and priorities had to shift. After she passed, it was about survival, keeping a roof over our heads and food on the table. There wasn't time or money for training. The honesty in his voice seemed to catch the parents off guard. These were people accustomed to success stories, to narratives of continuous upward trajectory. Joe's admission of struggle and loss introduced a note of reality that made the conversation suddenly more human. I'm sorry for your loss, Margaret said softly, her judicial reserve replaced by maternal warmth. That must have been incredibly difficult. It was, Joe replied simply, but it also taught me things about strength and perseverance that I never learned in any dojo. Before anyone could respond, the sound of children's voices filled the lobby as the trial class participants began arriving. Joe watched Lila's face transform as she saw kids her own age in training uniforms, the nervous excitement replacing her earlier apprehension. Mom, is that the girl Trevor told us about? A voice piped up from behind Dr. Chen, and Joe turned to see a boy who was clearly Trevor's younger brother, and same dark hair, same intelligent eyes, but with the additional energy of someone 2 years younger and twice as impatient. Kevin, remember your manners, Dr. Chen said automatically, but his tone was affectionate. This is Lila, and this is her father, Mr. Walker. Kevin stepped forward with the fearless confidence of a 6-year-old. Hi Lila, Trevor said you really want to learn karate. Do you know any moves yet? Lila glanced up at her father, who nodded encouragingly. Not really, she admitted. But my dad taught me how to stand in ready position and how to bow properly. Cool, can you show me? Without waiting for permission. Lila dropped into the basic ready stance Joe had taught her. Feet shoulder-width apart, hands relaxed at her sides, spine straight, but not rigid. Then she performed a perfect standing bow, her movements precise and respectful. The simple demonstration had an unexpected effect on the watching parents. Dr. Chen smiled with genuine appreciation, while Margaret Holloway exchanged a meaningful look with Naomi. Even Robert Steinberg seemed impressed by the 8-year-old's focus and precision. Very nice form, Dr. Chen commented. Someone's been paying attention to detail. Daddy says that martial arts starts with respect, Lila replied seriously. Respect for yourself, respect for others, and respect for the art itself. Joe felt heat rise in his cheeks as the parents turned their attention back to him. He hadn't realized how much of his old training philosophy he'd been sharing with Lila during their evening conversations. That's a fundamental principle, Margaret observed. Many students take years to really understand that concept. Children often understand important things more quickly than adults give them credit for, Joe said carefully. They haven't learned to complicate simple truths yet. Naomi had been watching this exchange with obvious satisfaction, but now she clapped her hands together to gather everyone's attention. I think it's time to move into the studio and begin our trial class. Parents, you're welcome to observe from the viewing area. Students, please line up by height. The transition from lobby to training space marked a subtle but significant shift in atmosphere. The polished floors and mirrored walls of Studio A seemed to amplify every sound, every movement. Joe felt his old training instincts awakening as he stepped onto the familiar surface of a dojo. The automatic straightening of his spine, the unconscious cataloging of space and distance, the mental preparation for focused work. 10 children formed a ragged line in order of height, ranging from Kevin Chen, at barely 4 feet tall, to Emma Holloway at nearly 5'6". Lila found her place near the younger end, between Kevin and a serious-looking girl with blonde pigtails who introduced herself as Sophie Martinez. "Good morning, class," Naomi said, her voice carrying easily across the studio. "Today we have some new friends joining us, and we also have a special assistant instructor. Mr. Walker will be helping us explore some traditional techniques and concepts." Joe stepped forward, acutely aware of every eye in the room, both student and parent. Through the viewing windows, he could see the adults settling into chairs, their attention focused entirely on him. This was his moment of truth. The point where good intentions either transformed into genuine capability or collapsed under the weight of unrealistic expectations. "Class bow to Mr. Walker," Naomi instructed. 10 young voices responded in unison. "Good morning, Mr. Walker." Their synchronized bow was enthusiastic, if not entirely uniform, and Joe felt something stir in his chest, a familiar warmth he hadn't experienced in years. "Good morning, class," he replied, returning their bow with the precise depth and timing his old sensei had drilled into him decades ago. "It's an honor to train with you today." "Mr. Walker," Naomi continued, "would you like to begin with some basic warm-up exercises?" This was it, the moment where theory became practice, where memories of old skills either resurged or failed him completely. Joe looked out at the expectant faces of the children, at Lila's nervous but trusting expression, at the parents watching through the glass with varying degrees of skepticism and hope. "Absolutely," he said, his voice growing stronger as muscle memory began to override anxiety. "Let's start with proper stance and breathing. Everything in martial arts builds from a strong foundation." He moved to the center of the line, demonstrating the basic ready position with movements that felt rusty but fundamentally sound. Feet shoulder-width apart, weight evenly distributed, spine straight but relaxed. Your stance should feel like a tree, rooted but flexible. The children mimicked his position with varying degrees of success. Joe walked down the line, offering gentle corrections and encouragement, his trained eye automatically assessing each student's natural balance and coordination. "Kevin, excellent flexibility, but try to keep your shoulders down. Sophie, beautiful posture. Can you feel how stable that makes you? Emma, perfect. You've clearly been practicing." When he reached Lila, she was holding the stance with trembling intensity, every muscle tensed with effort. Joe knelt beside her, his voice dropping to a gentle whisper only she could hear. "Breathe, baby girl. Strong doesn't mean tight. Let your strength come from your center, not from fighting yourself." Lila's exhale was audible as she released the unnecessary tension, and immediately her stance became more natural and sustainable. Joe smiled and moved on, but not before catching sight of Dr. Chen nodding approvingly through the viewing window. "Now we're going to work on breathing," Joe announced, returning to the front of the class. "In martial arts, your breath is your power source. Watch and listen." He demonstrated the deep, controlled breathing patterns he'd learned years ago, inhaling through the nose for 4 counts, holding for 4, exhaling through the mouth for 6. The rhythm was meditative, focusing, designed to calm the mind and energize the body simultaneously. "This isn't just about air," Joe explained as the children followed along. "This is about connecting your mind and body, about finding your center. When you breathe correctly, everything else becomes easier." From the corner of his eye, Joe could see Naomi watching with obvious approval. More importantly, he could see the children beginning to settle into the rhythm, their initial nervousness giving way to focused concentration. "Excellent," he said after several minutes of breathing practice. "Now who can tell me what martial arts is really about?" Hands shot up immediately. Joe pointed to Trevor, who had arrived just as class began, and squeezed into line next to Lila. "Fighting?" Trevor offered tentatively. "That's one aspect," Joe acknowledged. "What else?" "Self-defense," called out one of the Steinberg twins. "Also true. Sophie, discipline and respect," the blonde girl said seriously. "Absolutely. Emma, building confidence and character," Emma replied with the maturity of a 12-year-old who had clearly heard these concepts before. Joe nodded approvingly at each answer, then stepped closer to the center of the group. "All of those answers are correct, but I want to share something with you that my old sensei taught me. He said that martial arts isn't about becoming someone different. It's about becoming who you really are underneath all the fear and doubt and confusion." The studio fell silent, except for the quiet hum of the ventilation system. Even the parents in the viewing area seemed to lean forward, slightly drawn in by the unexpected depth of the discussion. "Every one of you already has everything you need to be strong, to be brave, to be kind." Joe continued, his voice carrying the conviction of hard-earned wisdom. "Martial arts just helps you find those qualities and learn to use them." Lila's hand went up. "Daddy, I mean Mr. Walker, what if you're too small to be strong?" The question hit Joe like a physical blow, both because of its innocent honesty and because he recognized the fear behind it. His daughter had spent her entire life feeling small in a world that seemed too big, too expensive, too demanding for someone like her. "Lila, that's an excellent question," Joe said, kneeling down to her eye level. "Can I show everyone something?" He gestured for her to step forward, then positioned himself in front of her in a basic pushing stance, hands extended, feet braced clearly, prepared to resist force. "I want you to try to push me backward," he said. "Use all your strength." Lila looked uncertain, but she placed her small hands against his and pushed with everything she had. Joe held firm, unmoved by her efforts, and after a few seconds, she stepped back with a frustrated sigh. "Now," Joe said, "I want you to try something different. Instead of pushing against my strength, I want you to use my strength against me. When I push forward, you step aside and pull me in the direction I'm already going." He demonstrated the concept slowly, showing how redirection could overcome superior force. Then they tried it again, with Lila stepping to the side and guiding his forward momentum. This time, Joe found himself stumbling forward off balance and vulnerable. "See?" Joe said, straightening up with a smile. "Size isn't everything. Intelligence, timing, and technique can overcome raw power every time." The children erupted in excited chatter, and Joe could see several of them trying the concept with their neighbors. More importantly, he could see understanding dawning in Lila's eyes, not just of the technique, but of the larger principle it represented. "That's the first rule of martial arts," Joe announced to the class. "Your greatest weakness can become your greatest strength if you learn to use it correctly." "Can you show us some real techniques?" asked one of the Steinberg boys, Jake, Joe thought, though telling the twins apart was proving challenging. Joe glanced at Naomi, who nodded encouragingly. "We can start with some basic movements," he said. "But remember, these are tools for learning, not weapons for hurting. The first person you must defeat in martial arts is yourself, your impatience, your anger, your desire to show off." He began with the most fundamental of karate techniques, the basic punch. Not the wild swinging most people associated with fighting, but the precise, controlled movement that began in the feet, traveled through the legs and hips, and ended in perfect extension and focus. "Power comes from your whole body, not just your arm," Joe explained, demonstrating the technique in slow motion. "Watch how my feet, legs, hips, and shoulders all work together." The children mimicked his movements with varying degrees of success, and Joe moved among them, offering corrections and encouragement. He was surprised by how quickly his teaching instincts returned, how naturally he fell into the rhythm of demonstration, observation, and gentle correction. "Trevor, excellent technique, but remember to keep your other hand up for protection. Kevin, try to keep your wrists straight. Imagine you're holding a glass of water that you don't want to spill." Sophie. "Beautiful form. Can you feel how that punch starts in your feet?" When he reached Lila, she was practicing with intense concentration, her small face serious with effort. Her technique was far from perfect, but Joe could see the dedication in every movement, the determination to master whatever he taught her. "How does it feel, baby girl?" he asked quietly. "Like I'm stronger than I thought," she replied without breaking her practice rhythm. "Like maybe I'm not too small after all." The simple statement hit Joe harder than any physical blow could have. He had to clear his throat before responding, acutely aware of the parents watching through the glass. "You were never too small," he said softly. "You just needed to find the right way to be big." As the class progressed, Joe found himself settling into a rhythm he hadn't experienced in years. The familiar cycle of teaching, correcting, encouraging, and inspiring felt like putting on comfortable clothes after too long in ill-fitting garments. His movements became more fluid, his voice more confident, his connection with the students more natural. They worked through basic blocks, simple kicks, and fundamental stances. With each technique, Joe emphasized not just the physical mechanics, but the mental discipline required to execute them properly. He talked about focus, about perseverance, about the importance of practice and patience. "Martial arts is like learning to play the piano," he explained as they practiced basic combinations. "At first, every note takes all your concentration, but eventually your fingers know where to go without your brain having to think about it. The same thing happens with these techniques. Practice makes them automatic." Through the viewing window, Joe could see the parents leaning forward with obvious interest. Chen was nodding approvingly at his son's progress, while Margaret Holloway seemed impressed by the way Joe balanced technical instruction with character development. Even Robert Steinberg, who had initially seemed the most skeptical, was watching with what appeared to be genuine respect. But it was Naomi's expression that gave Joe the most confidence. She was observing not just the technical aspects of his teaching, but the way he connected with the children, the way he made each student feel seen and valued. Her occasional nods of approval told him he was exceeding her expectations. As the class neared its end, Joe decided to demonstrate one of the more advanced techniques from his own training, a combination that showcased the flowing beauty of traditional karate when executed properly. He moved through the kata slowly, letting the children see how individual techniques could be woven together into something that looked almost like dance. The studio fell silent as Joe's body remembered movements he hadn't performed in years. His techniques weren't perfect time, and disuse had robbed him of some of his precision. But the fundamental understanding was still there, the deep muscle memory of thousands of hours of practice. When he finished, the children burst into spontaneous applause, and Joe felt a flush of pride and accomplishment he hadn't experienced since Lila was born. That was beautiful, Sophie exclaimed. It looked like you were telling a story with your body. In a way I was, Joe replied, slightly breathless, but energized. Every kata tells the story of a fight, not against an enemy, but against your own limitations. Can we learn to do that? Trevor asked eagerly. Someday if you keep practicing and never give up, Joe promised. But remember, mastery isn't about how fast you learn, it's about how consistently you practice. As the formal class ended and the children began to disperse, Joe felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Dr. Chen approaching with Trevor in tow. Mr. Walker, the doctor said, extending his hand once again. That was genuinely impressive. Trevor hasn't stopped talking about the redirection technique you demonstrated. He's been trying to practice it on his little brother all morning. Joe laughed, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders. I hope Kevin's been a willing practice partner. Mostly, Dr. Chen replied with a smile. But seriously, your approach to teaching, emphasizing principle over technique, character over competition, that's exactly what we've been hoping for. Trevor tends to get frustrated when things don't come easily, but today he seemed to understand that struggle is part of the process. Every student learns differently, Joe said carefully. The key is finding what motivates each individual child. Exactly, Dr. Chen agreed. Listen, I know this might be presumptuous, but would you be interested in giving Trevor some private lessons? I think he could benefit from your perspective. And honestly, after watching you teach today, I'd trust you with my son's development. The offer caught Joe completely off guard. Private lessons meant additional income, financial stability, the possibility of building something more than just survival. But it also meant responsibility, commitment, the risk of disappointing someone who was placing their trust in him. I'd be honored, Joe said slowly. But I should mention that I'm still learning how to teach again. It's been a long time since I was in a formal instructional role. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who remember what it's like to be beginners, Dr. Chen replied. Think about it and let me know. My contact information is on file with Mrs. Sinclair. As Dr. Chen and Trevor departed, Joe found himself surrounded by other parents offering similar sentiments. Margaret Holloway mentioned that Emma had seemed more engaged than usual, while Robert Steinberg grudgingly admitted that his twins had shown more focus in one session than they typically demonstrated in a month. But it was the conversation with Naomi that mattered most. She approached as the last of the families were leaving, her expression unreadable, but her eyes bright with something that looked like satisfaction. Well? She asked simply. Joe looked around the now empty studio at the mirrors that had reflected his rediscovered confidence, at the space where his daughter had taken her first formal steps into the martial arts world he'd thought he'd lost forever. It felt like coming home, he admitted quietly. Like remembering who I used to be before life got so complicated. And how do you feel about who you might become? Naomi asked perceptively. Joe watched through the viewing windows as Lila demonstrated her new ready stance to a group of younger children in the lobby, her face glowing with pride and newfound confidence. Terrified, he said honestly, but also more hopeful than I've been in years. Naomi smiled, the first completely unguarded expression he'd seen from her. Good, she said. Fear and hope are excellent motivators. The question is, are you ready to find out what happens when you stop playing it safe? Joe looked at his daughter one more time, seeing not just the 8-year-old girl who depended on him for everything, but the young woman she might become if he had the courage to give her the opportunities she deserved. Ask me Monday morning, he said finally. I think I need the weekend to process everything that just happened. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, Joe couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The carefully constructed barriers he'd built around his old life were beginning to crack, and light was starting to seep through the fractures. Monday morning arrived with a decision that felt as inevitable as sunrise. Joe stood in Naomi's office at 8:15, still wearing his janitor's uniform, but carrying himself with a newfound sense of purpose that hadn't been there the week before. Through the office windows, he could see early morning students arriving for classes, their movements crisp and focused, in the way that spoke of established routine. "I've been thinking about your offer all weekend," Joe said without preamble, meeting Naomi's expectant gaze directly. "About what you said regarding playing it safe." Naomi leaned back in her chair, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes bright with interest. "And what conclusions did you reach?" "That safe hasn't gotten us very far," Joe replied, thinking of the cramped apartment, the endless cycle of barely making ends meet the dreams he'd buried so deep he'd almost forgotten they existed. "Lila deserves better than a father who's too afraid to try." The words hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of transformation and the promise of uncertainty. Naomi nodded slowly, as if Joe had confirmed something she'd already suspected. "There are conditions," she said, pulling a folder from her desk drawer. "This isn't charity, Joe. If you're going to be part of this academy's instructional staff, you'll be held to the same standards as any other teacher. That means continuing education, professional development, and absolute commitment to our students' welfare." Joe accepted the folder, scanning the contents quickly. Training schedules, curriculum guidelines, liability waivers, and a contract that offered more money. Years enough to move Lila to a better school district, enough to stop choosing between groceries and medical bills. "There's something else," Naomi continued, her tone shifting to something more serious. "Marcus isn't happy about this arrangement. He's been with us for 3 years, and he considers this academy his domain. Having you here challenges his authority in ways that make him uncomfortable." "I'm not trying to challenge anyone," Joe said carefully. "I just want to teach kids and provide for my daughter." "I know that, and you know that, but Marcus sees any change as a threat to his position. He's already called a meeting with the board of directors for Thursday evening. He wants to discuss maintaining instructional standards and protecting the academy's reputation." Joe felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach, the same sensation he'd experienced countless times when job security hung in the balance. "Are you saying this might not work out after all?" "I'm saying that nothing worthwhile comes without opposition," Naomi replied firmly. "But Joe, I didn't build this academy by backing down from fights that mattered. The question is whether you're prepared for the battle ahead." Before Joe could respond, a commotion erupted from the main training area. Raised voices, the sound of something hitting the mat hard, and then the unmistakable tone of adult anger, poorly disguised as instruction. Both Joe and Naomi moved toward the sound arriving at Studio A, just as Marcus's voice reached a crescendo of frustration. "I don't care if your parents think you're special," Marcus was shouting at a boy of about 10, who was sitting on the mat looking dazed and hurt. "In here, you follow my instructions exactly, or you get out." Joe recognized the student immediately, David Park, whose mother worked as a nurse at the local hospital, and scraped together the tuition payments with visible difficulty. The boy was smaller than most of his classmates, quieter, the kind of kid who tried hard, but lacked the natural athleticism that made techniques come easily. "David, what happened?" Naomi asked, moving quickly to the boy's side while shooting Marcus a look that could have frozen fire. "I was trying to do the combination like Coach Mason showed us," David said quietly, his voice trembling with the effort not to cry. "But I kept messing up the timing, and when I asked if he could show me again, He said I wasn't paying attention and made me do 50 push-ups. When I couldn't finish them all, he threw me. Joe's hands clenched involuntarily at his sides. He looked at Marcus, whose face was flushed with defensive anger, then at David, whose uniform was torn at the shoulder and whose confidence had clearly been shattered along with his body. "Marcus?" Naomi's voice was deadly quiet. "In my office now." "Mrs. Sinclair, with all due respect, that boy has been disrupting my class for weeks with his constant questions and inability to keep up with the other students. Sometimes firm correction is necessary to maintain discipline." "Firm correction." Joe's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He hadn't meant to speak, but the sight of a child being humiliated for trying hard triggered something in him that overrode caution. "That's not correction, that's abuse." Marcus whirled on him, his face contorting with fury. "And what would you know about proper instruction, janitor? You think one trial class makes you qualified to judge my methods?" The insult hung in the air like a slap, and Joe felt every eye in the room focusing on him. Several other students had gathered at the edges of the mat, drawn by the confrontation, and he could see uncertainty and fear in their young faces. "I know that a real instructor builds students up instead of tearing them down." Joe said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "I know that strength comes from encouragement, not intimidation." "Pretty words from someone who's never had to deal with spoiled kids and demanding parents," Marcus sneered. "You want to see real instruction. You want to see what it takes to produce champions." Joe felt the challenge in the air, felt the weight of watching eyes and the pressure of a moment that would define everything that came after. He could walk away, apologize for overstepping, accept his place in the hierarchy, and hope for the best. Or he could stand up for what he believed for David, and for Lila, and for every kid who had ever been made to feel small by someone who was supposed to help them grow. "If you're asking me to demonstrate proper technique, I'd be happy to," Joe said quietly. "But not to prove anything to you. To show these kids that martial arts is about respect, control, and helping each other improve." Marcus's smile was sharp and predatory. "Fine, let's see what the janitor can really do." Naomi stepped forward, her expression alarmed. "Marcus, this is completely inappropriate. We are not turning my academy into some kind of ego-driven confrontation." "It's okay," Joe said, his voice carrying a calm certainty that surprised even him. "Sometimes the best teaching happens when principles are put to the test." He knelt beside David, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. "David, are you hurt anywhere? Can you stand up, okay?" The boy nodded, accepting Joe's hand up from the mat. "Mr. Walker, are you really going to fight Coach Mason?" "Not fight," Joe corrected gently. "Demonstrate. There's a big difference. Fighting is about hurting someone. Demonstration is about showing what's possible when you combine skill with control." As David moved safely to the sidelines, Joe turned to face Marcus across the mat. The other instructor had shed his outer shirt and was stretching with the deliberate showmanship of someone accustomed to being the most skilled person in the room. His movements were sharp, aggressive, designed to intimidate rather than prepare. Joe simply stood in ready position, his breathing slow and controlled, his posture relaxed but alert. He thought of his old sensei, of the countless hours spent learning that true strength came not from the ability to dominate others, but from the discipline to use power wisely. "Standard sparring rules?" Marcus asked, his tone making it clear he expected to make short work of the academy's newest instructor. "Whatever you think is appropriate," Joe replied. "But remember, we have children watching. What they see here will shape their understanding of what martial arts really means." Marcus's expression faltered slightly at the reminder, but his competitive instincts quickly reasserted themselves. He dropped into a fighting stance that was technically proficient, but radiating with barely controlled aggression. Joe remained in basic ready position, his hands open and relaxed at his sides. To the watching students, he probably looked unprepared, possibly even scared. But Naomi, who had reluctantly taken a position at the edge of the mat, recognized the stance of someone who had moved far beyond the need to prove anything through displays of force. "Begin when ready," she said quietly, her voice carrying reluctant authority. Marcus attacked immediately, launching a series of rapid punches and kicks designed to overwhelm and intimidate. His techniques were fast, precise, and backed by years of competitive training. Against most opponents, the assault would have been devastating. Joe moved like water around stone, flowing away from each attack with minimal effort, never striking back, never showing aggression, simply redirecting Marcus's energy and maintaining perfect balance. To the watching children, it looked almost magical, the way Joe seemed to know exactly where each strike was going before it arrived, the way he turned Marcus's own momentum against him without ever appearing to exert effort. "Stand still and fight," Marcus snarled, growing frustrated by his inability to land a clean strike. "I am fighting," Joe replied calmly, continuing his fluid defensive movement. "I'm fighting the urge to respond to anger with anger, to meet force with force. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is choose not to escalate." The truth of his words became evident as Marcus grew increasingly desperate, his techniques becoming wilder, his balance more compromised. Joe continued his defensive dance, occasionally reaching out to gently redirect a punch or subtly shift his weight to avoid a kick, but never once striking back. Finally, in a moment of perfect timing that seemed to arise naturally from the flow of movement, Joe simply stepped aside as Marcus threw a particularly aggressive combination. The instructor's own momentum carried him forward into empty space, and Joe's gentle guidance sent him tumbling to the mat in a controlled fall that demonstrated technique rather than dominance. Marcus rolled to his feet immediately, his face red with embarrassment and fury. "You're not even fighting, you're just running away." "Am I?" Joe asked mildly. "David, what did you see?" The boy stepped forward, his earlier fear replaced by wonder. "You never got hit, and you never hurt Coach Mason, even though you could have. You were showing him how to control himself, weren't you?" Joe smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. "Very good, David. What else did you notice?" "You never got angry," added Emma Holloway, who had arrived with her mother just in time to witness the demonstration. "Even when he was trying to hurt you, you stayed calm. And you made it look easy," Trevor Chen chimed in. "Like you were dancing instead of fighting." Joe turned back to Marcus, who was breathing heavily and clearly struggling to process what had just happened. "That's the difference between martial arts and fighting," Joe said quietly. "Fighting is about winning and losing, about proving you're stronger than someone else. Martial arts is about finding harmony, about using the minimum force necessary to resolve conflict." "Pretty philosophy," Marcus spat. "But this is the real world. These kids need to know how to defend themselves, not how to dance around problems." "You're absolutely right," Joe agreed, surprising everyone, including himself. "They do need to know how to defend themselves, but the first person they need to defend against is their own ego, their own anger, their own need to prove something to the world." He gestured to the watching students, whose faces showed a mixture of excitement and deep thought. "David, when you couldn't do the combination correctly, what did you feel?" "Frustrated," the boy admitted. "Like I was stupid for not getting it right away." "And when someone yells at you for being frustrated, how does that make you feel?" "Worse, like maybe I don't belong here." Joe nodded, then looked directly at Marcus. Every one of these children is here because they want to become stronger, more confident, more capable. But confidence isn't built through fear or intimidation. It's built through patient instruction, consistent encouragement, and the gradual mastery of increasingly difficult challenges. "Spare me the lecture," Marcus said, but his voice had lost its earlier venom. "You think you can just waltz in here and change everything overnight?" "I don't want to change anything that's working," Joe replied honestly. "But I do want to help create an environment where every student feels valued, where mistakes are treated as learning opportunities, and where strength is measured by character as much as technique." Naomi stepped forward, her expression unreadable but her posture suggesting she had reached some kind of decision. "Marcus, I think we need to have that conversation now, in my office." As the two administrators departed, Joe found himself surrounded by curious students. Their questions came rapid fire, overlapping each other in the way that children's conversations always seem to do. "Mr. Walker, how did you move like that? Could you teach us to be that calm? Were you scared at all? Can you show us how to do the redirecting thing?" Joe held up his hands for quiet smiling at their enthusiasm. "One question at a time. David, you asked first. How long did it take you to learn to fight like that?" David asked, his eyes bright with newfound respect. "I'm still learning," Joe replied honestly. "And what you saw wasn't really fighting, it was conversation. Marcus was speaking with anger and aggression, and I was responding with patience and redirection. The goal wasn't to win or lose, but to find a way to end the conflict without anyone getting hurt." "But you could have hurt him if you wanted to, couldn't you?" Emma asked with the perceptiveness of someone older than her years. Joe considered the question carefully. "Possibly. But the fact that I could doesn't mean I should. True strength isn't about what you can do to others, it's about what you choose not to do." "My dad says that's just philosophy," said one of the Steinberg twins. "He says in real life you have to be willing to fight for what matters." "Your father is absolutely right," Joe said, surprising the boy. "You do have to be willing to fight for what matters. But there are many different ways to fight. Sometimes you fight with your fists, sometimes with your words, sometimes with your example. The key is choosing the right tool for the right situation." As the impromptu discussion continued, Joe became aware of adult voices carrying from Naomi's office, raised, but not quite shouting, intense but controlled. Whatever conversation was happening between Naomi and Marcus, it was clearly serious and potentially decisive. "Mr. Walker." Lila's voice came from the edge of the group, and Joe turned to see his daughter approaching, with her usual mixture of pride and concern. "Are you in trouble?" The question made Joe's chest tighten. Lila had seen him lose jobs before, had watched opportunities disappear due to circumstances beyond their control, or his own inability to navigate complex social situations. The fear in her voice spoke to experiences no 8-year-old should have to carry. "I don't know, baby girl," Joe admitted, kneeling down to her level. "But whatever happens, we'll face it together, okay?" "I heard some of the other kids talking," Lila said quietly. "They said Coach Mason was really angry and that some parents might not want you teaching anymore." Joe felt the weight of adult politics pressing down on a situation that should have been simple and pure. The realization that his actions, however well-intentioned, might have consequences for his daughter's newfound sense of belonging hit him like a physical blow. "Lila, I want you to understand something," Joe said, his voice carrying the gravity of a father trying to explain complex realities to someone too young to fully comprehend them. "Sometimes doing the right thing makes people uncomfortable. Sometimes standing up for someone who's being treated unfairly creates problems you didn't expect. Like when you helped David, exactly like that. I saw someone being hurt, and I couldn't stand by and watch. But my actions might have consequences for me, for you, for this academy." Lila was quiet for a long moment, her young face serious with thought. When she spoke again, her words carried a wisdom that reminded Joe painfully of her mother. "Daddy, remember what you taught me about martial arts, being about becoming who you really are underneath all the fear and doubt." Joe nodded, wondering where she was going with this. "Well, maybe this is you becoming who you really are. Maybe helping David was more important than keeping things safe." The simple statement hit Joe with the force of revelation. His 8-year-old daughter had just articulated something he'd been struggling to understand about himself, that some choices were worth making, regardless of consequences, that integrity sometimes demanded action, even when safety counseled silence. Before he could respond, the office door opened, and Naomi emerged alone. Her expression was carefully composed, but Joe could see tension in the set of her shoulders, the slight tightness around her eyes that suggested difficult decisions had been made. "Mr. Walker, could I speak with you privately?" she asked, her tone giving nothing away. Joe squeezed Lila's hand gently. "Why don't you practice your forms with the other kids? I'll be right back." As he followed Naomi toward the office, Joe caught sight of Marcus gathering his things from his locker, his movements sharp with barely controlled anger. The other instructor's face was flushed, his jaw set in the rigid line of someone who had just received news he didn't want to hear. "Walker," Marcus called out as Joe passed. "I hope you're happy. I hope proving your point was worth destroying everything I've built here." The accusation stung partly because Joe could hear genuine pain beneath the anger. Whatever had happened in that office, Marcus clearly felt betrayed, dismissed, diminished in ways that went beyond professional disagreement. "Marcus, I never wanted," Joe began, but the other instructor cut him off with a harsh laugh. "Save it. You waltzed in here playing the humble hero, but this was always about taking my job, wasn't it? Naomi can dress it up however she wants, but we both know what really happened here." With that, Marcus shouldered his gym bag and stalked toward the exit, leaving Joe standing in the hallway with a growing sense of unease. Whatever victory he might have won felt hollow in the face of Marcus's obvious devastation. "Joe," Naomi's voice called from the office doorway. "Please." Inside the office, Naomi gestured for Joe to take a seat across from her desk. Her usual composure seemed strained, and Joe could see the weight of difficult decisions in the way she moved, the careful precision of someone trying to maintain control in a situation that had spiraled beyond anyone's intentions. "I need to be honest with you," Naomi began without preamble. "What happened out there forced me to make a choice I'd been hoping to avoid." Joe felt his stomach drop. "You're letting me go." "No," Naomi said quickly. "I'm not letting you go. But I have asked Marcus to take a leave of absence while he reconsiders his teaching methods and his commitment to our academy's values." The news should have felt like victory, but instead Joe felt only a growing sense of responsibility and uncertainty. "Mrs. Sinclair, I never intended for this to happen. I just saw a kid being mistreated and couldn't stand by and watch." "I know," Naomi replied. "And that's exactly why I made the decision I did." Joe Marcus is a skilled martial artist, but he's forgotten something essential about teaching children. He's become more concerned with producing winners than with developing character. She leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "What you demonstrated out there, both in how you handled the confrontation and in how you spoke to the students afterward, that's what real instruction looks like. You reminded everyone in that room why they fell in love with martial arts in the first place." "But Marcus was right about one thing," Joe said quietly. "I am just getting started here. These parents have invested their trust and their money in an established program. How do I prove that their confidence isn't misplaced? Naomi smiled for the first time since the confrontation. The same way you proved yourself today. By showing up, by caring more about the students than about yourself, and by never forgetting that every child who walks through these doors is someone's most precious gift. She pulled out another folder thicker than the first one Joe had received. This contains the curriculum guidelines for our intermediate and advanced classes. Marcus was scheduled to teach 4 classes a day, 5 days a week. If you're willing to take on that responsibility, the position is yours. Joe stared at the folder, his mind racing with the implications. 4 classes a day meant full-time income, health insurance, the ability to provide for Lila in ways he'd only dreamed about. But it also meant stepping completely out of his comfort zone, taking responsibility for the development of dozens of children whose parents expected excellence. There's something else you should know, Naomi continued. The board meeting Marcus mentioned. It's still happening Thursday evening. Several parents have expressed concerns about the changes to our instructional staff, and they want to meet you before making any decisions about their children's continued enrollment. What kind of concerns? Joe asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The usual ones. Questions about your qualifications, your teaching experience, your ability to prepare their children for competition. Some parents see martial arts as an investment in their child's future college applications or athletic scholarships. They want assurance that you can deliver results. Joe thought about the children he'd just taught, about David's eagerness to learn, despite his struggles, about Lila's growing confidence, about the light in Trevor's eyes when he mastered a new technique. Were those not results? Was character development not worth measuring? I understand their concerns, Joe said finally, but I need them to understand something too. I'm not here to produce trophy winners or to pad college applications. I'm here to help children discover their own strength, their own resilience, their own capacity for growth. And if they don't think that's enough? Naomi asked gently. Joe looked out the office window at the training floor, where Lila was practicing her forms alongside children who had welcomed her, despite their obvious differences in background and circumstances. He watched David demonstrating a technique to a younger student, his earlier humiliation transformed into teaching confidence. Then we'll find the families who do think it's enough, Joe said with growing certainty. Because there are parents out there who understand that raising strong human beings is more important than raising successful competitors. Naomi's smile was radiant. That's exactly the answer I was hoping for. As Joe prepared to leave the office, Naomi called his name one more time. Joe. What you did today took tremendous courage. Standing up for David, challenging Marcus's methods, accepting the responsibility that comes with this position, none of that was easy or safe. It was necessary, Joe replied simply. And maybe that's enough. Walking back onto the training floor, Joe felt the weight of transformation settling around his shoulders like a familiar jacket. The man who had mopped these floors just hours ago was gone, replaced by someone willing to risk everything for the chance to make a real difference in children's lives. Lila ran to him immediately, her face bright with questions and hope. Daddy, are we staying? Joe lifted his daughter up, holding her close as he surveyed the academy that had become their unexpected sanctuary. We're staying, baby girl. We're definitely staying. But even as he spoke the words, Joe could feel the approaching storm. Thursday's board meeting would test everything they'd built in these few short days, and the parents who attended would have the power to transform their newfound hope into distant memory. The real battle, he was beginning to realize, was just beginning. Thursday evening came too quickly and not quickly enough. Joe stood in the academy's main conference room at 6:45, adjusting his tie for the third time and trying to calm the nervous energy that had been building all week. The room felt different in the evening light, more formal, more intimidating with its polished table and leather chairs arranged in a configuration that suggested judgment rather than collaboration. Through the conference room windows, he could see parents arriving in the parking lot, their expensive cars gleaming under the streetlights. These were the same people who had watched him teach their children just days ago, but tonight they wore their professional personas like armor, the surgeon's precision, the lawyer's skepticism, the executive's calculating assessment of risk and return. "You look terrified," Naomi observed, entering the room with a stack of folders and her usual composed confidence. "I am terrified," Joe admitted, grateful for her honesty in return. "These people have every right to question whether someone like me belongs in their children's lives." "Someone like you?" Naomi's eyebrows rose in challenge. "You mean someone who cares more about character than competition? Someone who sees potential in every child instead of just the naturally gifted ones? Someone who understands that real strength comes from overcoming adversity rather than avoiding it?" Before Joe could respond, the first families began filtering into the room. Dr. Chen entered with his characteristic professional bearing, nodding politely to Joe before taking a seat near the head of the table. Margaret Holloway followed, her judicial experience evident in the way she assessed the room's dynamics before choosing her position. Robert Steinberg arrived with his wife Patricia, both of them carrying the controlled intensity of people accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. But it was the faces Joe didn't recognize that concerned him most: parents whose children he hadn't taught, whose first impression of him would be filtered through second-hand accounts, and whatever preconceptions they brought about janitors who claimed to be martial arts instructors. "Ladies and gentlemen," Naomi began once everyone had settled, "thank you for taking time from your busy schedules to discuss some important changes to our Academy's instructional program. As you know, we've recently added Joe Walker to our teaching staff, and several of you have expressed interest in learning more about his background and teaching philosophy." A woman Joe didn't recognize, elegant, expensively dressed with the sharp features of someone unaccustomed to having her authority questioned, leaned forward immediately. "Mrs. Sinclair, I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Mr. Walker was employed here as custodial staff. Now we're expected to trust him with our children's martial arts education. What exactly are his credentials?" The question hit the room like a thrown stone, creating ripples of tension that reached every corner. Joe felt every eye focus on him, felt the weight of judgment and skepticism pressing down like a physical force. "That's a fair question, Mrs. Blackwood," Joe said, standing slowly and meeting her gaze directly. "My name is Joe Walker. I hold a second-degree black belt in Shotokan karate and a brown belt in judo, earned over 12 years of training under Sensei James Kobayashi in Boston. I stopped training when my wife became ill with cancer, and after she passed away, my focus shifted entirely to survival, keeping a roof over my daughter's head and food on our table." He paused, letting the honesty of his words settle in the room. "You're right to question my credentials. A teaching certificate from 15 years ago doesn't automatically qualify me to educate your children today. But I hope my actions this week have demonstrated something more important than credentials: a genuine commitment to helping every student discover their own potential." Dr. Chen spoke up from his position near the head of the table. "I can speak to that commitment. My son Trevor has been more engaged in his training this week than in the previous 3 months combined. Mr. Walker has a gift for making complex concepts accessible to young minds." "With respect, Dr. Chen," Mrs. Blackwood replied coolly, "engagement isn't the same as results. My daughter Stephanie has been training here for 2 years. She's ranked 3rd in the state for her age group, and she has legitimate aspirations for national competition. Can Mr. Walker provide the level of technical instruction required for that level of achievement?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Joe felt the familiar weight of being judged by standards he'd never been asked to meet. He thought of Stephanie Blackwood, a talented 12-year-old whose technique was flawless, but whose approach to training seemed driven more by parental pressure than personal passion. "Mrs. Blackwood," Joe said carefully, "I've observed Stephanie's training this week and she's undoubtedly skilled, but I've also noticed that she seems to carry a tremendous amount of pressure to perform. My approach would focus on helping her rediscover the joy in training while continuing to develop her technical abilities." "Joy." Mrs. Blackwood's voice sharpened. "Mr. Walker, joy doesn't win competitions. Discipline, precision, and superior instruction win competitions. Can you provide those things?" Before Joe could answer, Margaret Holloway's voice cut through the tension with judicial authority. "Sarah, I think you're missing something important here. Emma has been training with various instructors for 4 years, and this is the first time she's come home excited about applying martial arts principles to other areas of her life. Yesterday, she resolved a conflict with her younger brother using redirection techniques instead of arguing. That's not just martial arts instruction, that's life education." "Life education doesn't get you into Stanford," Mrs. Blackwood replied sharply. "Emma's academics are important, but competitive martial arts can provide scholarship opportunities and demonstrate the kind of discipline colleges look for in applicants." Joe felt the conversation pulling toward familiar territory, the reduction of children's development to measurable outcomes, the transformation of growth into commodity. He thought of David Park's demolished confidence, of Lila's desperate desire to belong, of the way competitive pressure could drain the humanity from something beautiful. "Mrs. Blackwood," Joe said quietly, "may I ask you something? When did Stephanie first express interest in martial arts?" The question seemed to catch the woman off guard. "She was 6. She saw a demonstration at her school and came home begging for lessons." "And what did she say she loved about it?" Mrs. Blackwood's expression softened slightly, as if she were accessing a memory that had been buried under years of tournament schedules and ranking pressures. "She said it looked like dancing, but stronger. She said the people looked peaceful even when they were moving fast." "Has she mentioned feeling peaceful about her training lately?" Joe asked gently. The silence that followed was answer enough. Mrs. Blackwood's composed facade cracked slightly, revealing something that looked like uncertainty, possibly even regret. "Competition can be valuable," Joe continued, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "It teaches goal-setting, perseverance, grace under pressure. But when competition becomes the only measure of success, we risk losing the very qualities that drew our children to martial arts in the first place." Robert Steinberg leaned forward, his investment banker's instincts clearly engaged. "Mr. Walker, that's a nice philosophy, but let's talk practical realities. We're paying premium tuition for premium instruction. How do we measure return on investment, if not through competitive results?" Joe had been expecting this question, the businessman's need to quantify value, to reduce human development to metrics and benchmarks. He thought of his own childhood training, of the qualities that had sustained him through his wife's illness and death, of the lessons that had nothing to do with trophies, but everything to do with survival. "Mr. Steinberg, how do you measure your return on investment when your sons learn to control their temper instead of lashing out at siblings? What's the value when they develop the confidence to stand up to bullies without becoming bullies themselves? How do you quantify the moment when they realize their own potential and decide to pursue excellence not because they have to, but because they want to?" Patricia Steinberg, who had been silent until now, spoke up with surprising emotion. "Actually, that answers something that's been bothering me. Jake and Jeremy have always been competitive with each other, sometimes destructively so. But this week I watched Jake help his brother with a technique he was struggling with instead of gloating about his own superior performance. That's not something we've seen before. Competition between siblings is natural, Robert replied, though his tone suggested he was processing his wife's observation. But learning to support each other, that's a life skill. The conversation was beginning to shift, and Joe could feel the room's energy transforming from confrontation to consideration. But Mrs. Blackwood wasn't finished. "This is all very heartwarming," she said, her voice carrying the edge of someone who felt her position being undermined. "But we still haven't addressed the fundamental question of qualifications, Mr. Walker. What makes you think you can provide the same level of instruction as someone like Marcus Mason, who has been teaching for years?" The mention of Marcus created a moment of uncomfortable silence. Everyone in the room knew about the confrontation about Marcus's departure, about the circumstances that had led to Joe's unexpected promotion. "I can't provide the same instruction as Marcus," Joe said honestly. "Our approaches are fundamentally different. Marcus focused on perfection, on producing technically flawless students who could execute techniques with military precision. That's valuable, and some students thrive under that kind of instruction." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I've seen what happens when the pursuit of perfection becomes more important than the development of the person. I've watched children lose their confidence because they couldn't meet impossible standards, seen them quit activities they loved because they felt they weren't good enough." "So you're saying Marcus was wrong?" Mrs. Blackwood pressed. "I'm saying Marcus and I have different definitions of success," Joe replied. "His definition was based on external achievements, tournament wins, perfect technique, execution, measurable performance metrics. My definition is based on internal development, confidence, resilience, character, the ability to face challenges with dignity and grace." Dr. Chen nodded slowly. "Those aren't mutually exclusive goals, are they? Can't students develop character and compete successfully?" "Absolutely," Joe agreed. "But the character development has to come first. A student who understands why they're training, who has internalized the principles of respect and perseverance, will ultimately perform better in competition than someone who's simply going through the motions of perfect technique." A new voice entered the conversation, David Park's mother Anna, who had been sitting quietly near the back of the room. "I'd like to say something if that's okay." Naomi nodded encouragingly. "Of course, Anna." "David has been struggling in classes for months," Anna said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of a single mother working double shifts to afford academy tuition. "Marcus made it clear that David wasn't keeping up, that maybe martial arts wasn't for him. I was actually considering withdrawing him because his confidence was completely shattered." She looked directly at Joe, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But after your first class, David came home different. He was excited practicing his forms in the living room, talking about balance and patience and finding strength in unexpected places. For the first time in months, he felt like he belonged." "Anna," Mrs. Blackwood said, with barely concealed impatience, "that's a lovely story, but we can't base instructional decisions on one child's emotional response." "Why not?" Margaret Holloway's judicial voice cut through the dismissal like a blade. "Sarah, we're talking about children, not products on an assembly line. Emotional response is exactly what we should be considering." The room fell silent as the two women stared at each other across the conference table. Joe could feel the tension between different philosophies of child-rearing, different approaches to success and achievement. "May I tell you about my daughter?" Joe asked quietly, drawing attention back to himself. "Lila has spent her entire life feeling too small, too poor, too different to belong anywhere meaningful. When she watched your children training, she saw something she desperately wanted, but believed was beyond her reach. His voice grew stronger as he continued. This week, she learned her first kata. Not perfectly, not with flawless technique, but with complete dedication and growing confidence. She made friends with children from different backgrounds, different circumstances. She discovered that strength isn't about what you have, it's about what you do with whatever you've been given. Joe looked around the room, meeting each parent's eyes in turn. That transformation didn't happen because I taught her perfect technique. It happened because she felt valued, encouraged, and challenged to grow at her own pace while striving for her personal best. And what about children who are already performing at a high level? Mrs. Blackwood asked, though her tone had lost some of its earlier edge. What can you offer students like Stephanie, who have already mastered the basics? Joe considered the question carefully. The highest level of martial arts isn't about technique, it's about understanding. Students like Stephanie have the technical foundation to explore deeper principles, the psychology of conflict resolution, the philosophy of strength through service, the leadership that comes from lifting others up instead of pushing them down. He thought of his demonstration with Marcus, of the way defensive movement could neutralize aggressive force without creating new conflict. Stephanie could learn to be a mentor for struggling students, developing teaching skills that would serve her throughout life. She could explore the mental aspects of competition, learning to find calm in chaos and strength in vulnerability. Patricia Steinberg leaned forward with obvious interest. That sounds like leadership development. It is leadership development, Joe confirmed. The best martial artists aren't just technically proficient. They're people others want to follow, learn from, and emulate. They understand that true strength comes from building others up, not from dominating them. But what about tournament preparation? Mrs. Blackwood pressed, though Joe could hear uncertainty creeping into her voice. Stephanie has qualified for regionals, and nationals are within reach. Can you provide the specialized training required for that level of competition? Joe felt the weight of the question, understood that his answer might determine not just his own future, but the Academy's direction and the children's opportunities. He thought of his own competitive experience, of the hunger for victory that had once driven him, of the way winning and losing had seemed like the most important things in the world. Mrs. Blackwood, I competed at the regional level when I was younger. I know what it takes to prepare for high-level competition. The physical conditioning, the mental preparation, the strategic thinking required to succeed against elite opponents. He paused, choosing his words with extreme care. But I also know what it takes to recover from defeat, to find meaning in effort, rather than just results, to maintain perspective when the pressure becomes overwhelming. If Stephanie wants to compete at nationals, I'll help her prepare. But I'll also help her understand that her worth as a person isn't determined by her tournament results. Mrs. Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, her carefully composed facade finally showing cracks that revealed something more human underneath. Stephanie has been having panic attacks before competitions, she admitted quietly. She's so afraid of disappointing us that she can barely sleep the night before tournaments. The confession hung in the air like a bridge between two worlds, the world of achievement and pressure that Mrs. Blackwood represented, and the world of human development and emotional health that Joe was advocating. Panic attacks are a sign that the pressure has become greater than the joy, Joe said gently. Competition should enhance a student's training, not dominate it. If Stephanie can rediscover why she loved martial arts in the first place, her competitive performance will likely improve because she'll be training from passion rather than fear. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. That aligns with research on optimal performance states. Athletes perform best when they're intrinsically motivated rather than driven by external pressure. So what exactly are you proposing? Robert Steinberg asked, his businessman's mind clearly working to understand the practical implications. Joe looked around the room, seeing faces that had shifted from skepticism to curiosity, from judgment to consideration. These were good parents who wanted the best for their children, even if they sometimes disagreed about what best meant. "I'm proposing a program that develops the whole student," Joe said with growing confidence. "Technical excellence, yes, but built on a foundation of character development, emotional intelligence, and genuine love for the art. Competition for those who want it, but not as the only measure of success. Individual attention for struggling students and leadership opportunities for advanced ones." "And how do we measure progress in a program like that?" Mrs. Blackwood asked, though her tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than challenge. Joe smiled, thinking of the changes he'd already seen in the children he'd taught. "The same way you measure any human development through observation assessment and long-term outcomes. Does the student show increased confidence? Are they more resilient in the face of challenges? Do they treat others with respect and kindness? Are they developing skills that will serve them throughout their lives?" Margaret Holloway leaned back in her chair with obvious satisfaction. "Those are exactly the qualities we want our children to develop. The technical skills are important, but they're tools for building character, not ends in themselves." Anna Park spoke up again, her voice stronger now. "I just want David to feel like he belongs somewhere, like he's capable of achieving something meaningful. If Mr. Walker can provide that, while also teaching him martial arts, then I support whatever changes are necessary." One by one, Joe watched the parents in the room shift from opposition to consideration to acceptance. Not unanimous agreement, Mrs. Blackwood still looked conflicted, and Robert Steinberg clearly had reservations about abandoning more traditional metrics of success. But there was enough support to move forward, enough trust to take the next step. "There's one more thing I want to address," Joe said, as the formal discussion seemed to be winding down. "The elephant in the room that we haven't talked about directly." The room fell silent, waiting for him to continue. "I know what you see when you look at me," Joe said, his voice carrying the weight of years of judgment and assumption. "You see someone who cleans your floors, someone whose paycheck depends on your generosity, someone who doesn't belong in the same social circles as your families." The discomfort in the room was palpable, but Joe pressed on. "And you're right about some of that. I don't have the financial resources. You have the professional credentials, the social connections. But I do have something else, the perspective that comes from struggle, from loss, from having to rebuild everything when life tears it all down." He looked directly at Mrs. Blackwood. "Your children live in a world of privilege and opportunity, and that's a tremendous gift. But someday they're going to face challenges that can't be solved with money or connections or perfect technique. When that happens, the lessons they learn about resilience, about finding strength in vulnerability, about getting back up. When life knocks them down, those lessons might be more valuable than any trophy they ever win." The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension, deeper, more thoughtful, charged with the recognition of truth that was uncomfortable but necessary. "Mr. Walker," Dr. Chen said finally, "I think you've given us a lot to consider. Speaking for myself, I'm convinced that Trevor would benefit from your approach to instruction. You have my support." "Mine as well," Margaret Holloway added firmly. "Emma needs exactly the kind of guidance you're describing." Patricia Steinberg nodded slowly. "The boys have been happier this week than they've been in months. That has to count for something." All eyes turned to Mrs. Blackwood, who had been silent through the last exchange. Joe could see the internal struggle playing out across her face, the conflict between her competitive instincts and her love for her daughter, between her desire for measurable success and her recognition of Stephanie's emotional needs. I need to know that Stephanie will still be prepared for competition, she said finally. Not because I need her to win, but because she's worked so hard to reach this level. She deserves the opportunity to see how far she can go. She'll be prepared, Joe promised. Better prepared than ever, because she'll be competing from joy rather than fear, from strength rather than desperation. Mrs. Blackwood was quiet for another long moment, then nodded slowly. All right. We'll try it your way. But I want regular progress reports, and if Stephanie's performance suffers, we'll need to reconsider. Naomi had been largely silent through the discussion, but now she stepped forward with obvious relief and satisfaction. Thank you all for your thoughtful consideration. Joe, congratulations on your unanimous vote of confidence. As the families began to gather their things and prepare to leave, Joe felt a mixture of elation and terror that reminded him of his first tournament competition decades ago. He had won the support he needed, but now came the harder challenge, living up to the trust these parents had placed in him, proving that character development and competitive excellence could coexist, demonstrating that sometimes the most unlikely teachers could provide the most valuable lessons. Dr. Chen approached as the room began to empty. Mr. Walker, I wanted to mention something. Trevor asked if he could bring a friend to class next week. A boy from his school whose family is going through some financial difficulties. Would that be possible? Joe felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with professional validation and everything to do with the recognition that his approach was already creating ripple effects beyond the academy's walls. Of course, Joe replied. Every child deserves the opportunity to discover their own strength. As the last family departed, and Joe found himself alone with Naomi in the conference room, he felt the full weight of what had just occurred, settling around his shoulders like a cloak. The scared janitor who had pushed his mop through these hallways just weeks ago was gone, replaced by someone who had been entrusted with shaping the next generation of martial artists. How do you feel? Naomi asked, her expression mixing pride with the anticipation of someone who had just set significant changes in motion. Joe looked out the conference room windows at the empty parking lot, at the streetlights illuminating the space where expensive cars had discharged their precious cargo for an evening of judgment and decision-making. In just a few days, those same cars would return, bringing children who would look to him for guidance, instruction, and the kind of patient encouragement that could transform not just their martial arts abilities, but their entire approach to life's challenges. Terrified, Joe admitted with a laugh that held equal parts fear and exhilaration, but also more certain than I've been about anything since Sarah died. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. Naomi smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose instincts had been validated by events. I knew it the first time I watched you interact with the children. You have something that can't be taught in any certification program. The ability to see potential where others see problems, to find strength where others see weakness. As they prepared to leave the academy for the evening, Joe thought about Lila waiting at home with Mrs. Rodriguez, their neighbor who watched her when Joe had evening obligations. His daughter would want to hear every detail of the meeting, would need reassurance that their newfound stability wasn't about to disappear again. But for the first time in years, Joe felt confident that he could provide that reassurance. Not because success was guaranteed, if anything the real challenges were just beginning, but because he finally understood that he had something valuable to offer. Something that went beyond technique or credentials or the ability to fit into social expectations. He had the perspective that came from rebuilding after everything fell apart, the wisdom that grew from choosing hope in the face of overwhelming odds, and the determination that emerged from having nothing left to lose except the chance to make a real difference in the world. Walking through the academy's empty training floors one last time before locking up, Joe felt the presence of all the children who would pass through these doors in the weeks and months ahead. Some would come seeking trophies and recognition, others looking for confidence and belonging. All of them would leave with something more valuable than they had brought: the understanding that their true strength had been inside them all along, waiting for the right teacher to help them discover it. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar song as Joe switched them off one by one, but for the first time since he'd started working in this building, the sound felt like music rather than monotony. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, new opportunities to prove that sometimes the best teachers were the ones who had learned their most important lessons outside any classroom. 3 months later, Joe stood at the edge of the academy's main training floor, watching something he never could have imagined when he first pushed his mop bucket through these doors. 60 children moved in perfect synchronization through the basic kata he'd taught them. Their voices unified as they counted in Japanese, their movements flowing with the kind of harmony that emerged when individual effort merged into collective purpose. But it wasn't the technical precision that brought tears to his eyes. It was the sight of Stephanie Blackwood patiently guiding David Park through a difficult sequence, her former competitive anxiety transformed into nurturing leadership. It was Trevor Chen helping his younger brother Kevin find balance in a challenging stance. Their sibling rivalry evolved into mutual support. It was Lila, his beautiful, confident daughter, demonstrating a technique to a group of newer students with the kind of quiet authority that spoke of deep understanding rather than superficial knowledge. The regional tournament results came in today, Naomi said quietly, appearing beside him with an envelope in her hand. Joe's stomach tightened automatically. Despite his philosophical opposition to measuring success through competition, he knew that tournament performance would be the metric many parents use to evaluate his teaching effectiveness. Stephanie had competed 3 weeks ago, her first major tournament, since Joe had taken over her training, and the waiting had been excruciating for everyone involved. "How did she do?" Joe asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Naomi's smile was radiant. She won her division. But more importantly, her mother called this morning to say it was the first competition where Stephanie actually enjoyed herself. No panic attacks, no sleepless nights beforehand, no tears after her first match. She competed with joy instead of fear. The news should have brought relief, but Joe found himself thinking about Marcus instead, the instructor whose departure had made this transformation possible but who had paid a personal price for the academy's evolution. Guilt had become Joe's constant companion over the past 3 months, the nagging awareness that his success had come at someone else's expense. "There's something else." Naomi continued, her expression shifting to something more complex. "Marcus called yesterday. He wants to meet with you." Joe felt his blood pressure spike. "What kind of meeting?" He didn't say specifically, but his tone was different. Not angry like I expected. More like someone who's been doing a lot of thinking. Before Joe could respond, a commotion near the academy's entrance drew his attention. A woman he didn't recognize was arguing with the receptionist, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone accustomed to getting her way through volume and intimidation. "I don't care about your enrollment procedures," the woman was saying. "My son needs to start training immediately, and I was told this academy produces champions." Joe excused himself from Naomi and approached the front desk, where he could see a boy of about 9 standing behind the woman with the hunched shoulders and downcast eyes of someone who had learned to make himself invisible during his mother's outbursts. "Ma'am, I'm Joe Walker, one of the instructors here," Joe said, using the calm tone he'd perfected for diffusing tense situations. "How can I help you?" The woman turned toward him, her expression shifting from irritation to barely concealed disdain as she took in his appearance. Even after 3 months of teaching, Joe still looked more like a working-class father than the stereotypical martial arts master, and some people found that fact impossible to reconcile with their expectations. "You're an instructor?" she asked skeptically. "I was expecting to speak with someone more senior." "Mrs. Walker is our head instructor," the receptionist clarified smoothly, having learned to navigate these conversations with diplomatic precision. "Mr. Walker," Joe corrected gently, noting how the woman's expression shifted at the correction, from skepticism to confusion to the kind of social calculation that happened when people realized their assumptions might have been wrong. "I'm Linda Morrison," the woman said, her tone marginally more respectful. "This is my son Alex. We just moved here from Chicago, and Alex needs to get back into serious training as quickly as possible. He was ranked second in his age group in Illinois before we relocated." Joe looked down at Alex, seeing the familiar signs of a child carrying pressure that was too heavy for young shoulders. The boy's posture spoke of someone who had learned to define himself through achievement, who feared disappointing the adults, whose approval seemed conditional on his performance. "Alex," Joe said, kneeling down to the boy's eye level, "what do you like most about martial arts?" The question seemed to catch both mother and son off guard. Alex glanced nervously at his mother before answering in a voice so quiet Joe had to strain to hear it. "I used to like the forms," Alex whispered. "They made me feel peaceful inside." "Used to?" Joe asked gently. "Mr. Walker," Mrs. Morrison interrupted, "Alex doesn't have time for philosophical discussions. He needs intensive training to prepare for next month's state championship qualifiers. In Chicago, he was training 6 days a week with private coaching sessions." Joe stood slowly, his mind racing, as he processed the implications of what he was hearing. This was a child who had been transformed from a student into a training machine, whose love for martial arts had been systematically replaced with the mechanical pursuit of rankings and qualifications. "Mrs. Morrison," Joe said carefully, "our program focuses on developing the whole student character, confidence, and technical skill working together. We do prepare students for competition, but always within the context of broader personal development." "Character development doesn't win trophies," Mrs. Morrison replied sharply, echoing almost exactly the same words Joe had heard from other parents over the past few months. "Alex has the potential to earn a college scholarship through martial arts, but only if he maintains his competitive edge." Joe felt the familiar tug of competing philosophies, the parent's desire for measurable success versus the child's need for emotional health and genuine growth. But something about Alex's defeated posture, about the way he seemed to shrink into himself when competition was mentioned, triggered every protective instinct Joe had developed as both a father and a teacher. "I understand your concerns about Alex's competitive future," Joe said diplomatically. "Would you mind if I worked with him for a few minutes, just to assess his current skill level and see how he responds to our teaching approach?" Mrs. Morrison checked her watch with obvious impatience. "I suppose that would be acceptable, but please keep in mind that Alex is accustomed to advanced instruction. He's beyond basic techniques." Joe led Alex onto the training floor, acutely aware of the boy's nervous energy and his mother's calculating observation from the sidelines. Around them, the evening class continued their kata practice, their unified movements creating a backdrop of focused calm. "Alex," Joe said softly, "I want you to show me your favorite form, not your best one, not the one that wins competitions, but the one that makes you feel most like yourself." The boy looked confused by the distinction. I don't understand. My sensei in Chicago always said the best form is the one that scores highest with judges." Joe felt his heart break a little at the response. Here was a child who had been so thoroughly conditioned to external validation that he'd lost touch with his own preferences and feelings. "Forget about judges for a minute," Joe said gently. "When you're alone in your room, when no one is watching, and there's no pressure to perform what movements feel natural. What kata makes you smile? Alex was quiet for a long moment, his young face serious with concentration. Then slowly, he began the opening movements of a basic form, not flashy or complex, but executed with a kind of flowing grace that spoke of natural talent and genuine connection to the art. As Alex moved through the kata, Joe could see glimpses of the joy that had been buried under layers of competitive pressure. The boy's shoulders relaxed, his breathing deepened, and for brief moments his face showed the kind of peaceful concentration that Joe remembered from his own early training. "Beautiful," Joe said, when Alex finished. "How did that feel?" "Good," Alex admitted, looking surprised by his own response. "It felt quiet inside." "That's exactly what martial arts should feel like," Joe confirmed. "That sense of inner quiet, of being completely present in your own body and mind." From the sidelines, Mrs. Morrison's voice carried clear disapproval. "Mr. Walker, that's a beginner's form. Alex mastered that kata 3 years ago. Surely you can see that he needs more challenging material." Joe looked at the woman, seeing the same competitive hunger he'd observed in dozens of parents over the past few months, the desire to use their children's achievements as validation of their own worth, the transformation of childhood development into a high-stakes investment strategy. "Mrs. Morrison," Joe said, making a decision that felt both risky and necessary. "May I ask you something? When Alex first started martial arts, what did you hope he would gain from the experience?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "Well, discipline, obviously, physical fitness, the ability to defend himself." "And has he gained those things?" "Of course, but then he's already succeeded," Joe interrupted gently. "Everything else, the competitions, the rankings, the scholarship possibilities, those are bonuses, not requirements." Mrs. Morrison's expression hardened. "Mr. Walker, I appreciate your philosophy, but we live in a competitive world. Alex needs every advantage he can get if he's going to succeed in life." Joe looked down at Alex, who was listening to this conversation with the defeated expression of someone who had heard similar discussions many times before. The boy's earlier moment of joy had evaporated, replaced by the familiar weight of expectations he was too young to carry. "Alex," Joe said suddenly, "would you like to learn something new, something that might help with competition, but is really about finding your own strength?" The boy nodded eagerly, grateful for any distraction from the adult discussion about his future. Joe demonstrated a simple breathing exercise, the same technique he'd taught to all his students, designed to center the mind and calm the nervous system. As Alex followed along, Joe could see the visible relaxation that came with proper breathing, the way tension melted from the boy's shoulders and face. "This is what we call finding your center," Joe explained. "It's not about technique or forms or winning competitions. It's about discovering the calm, strong place inside yourself that nothing external can disturb. In competition, this helps you stay focused when the pressure gets intense." Joe continued, knowing that Mrs. Morrison was listening to every word. "But more importantly, it helps you stay connected to the reasons you started training in the first place." As the breathing exercise continued, something remarkable happened. Other students began to notice Alex's obvious relaxation and started incorporating the same breathing pattern into their own practice. Within minutes, the entire class had unconsciously synchronized their breathing, creating an atmosphere of collective calm that was almost meditative. "That's the real magic of martial arts," Joe said softly, his words meant for Alex, but carrying clearly to Mrs. Morrison. "It's not about being better than other people. It's about becoming the best version of yourself and helping others do the same." When the exercise ended, Alex looked up at Joe with something approaching wonder. "I've never felt that calm during training before," he admitted. That's because you've been training your body, but not your spirit, Joe replied. True martial arts integrates both. Mrs. Morrison approached with visible reluctance, her earlier confidence clearly shaken by what she'd observed. Mr. Walker, I have to admit that Alex does seem more centered than usual, but I still have concerns about competitive preparation. What if I told you that students who train from a place of inner calm typically perform better in competition than those who train from anxiety and pressure? Joe asked. What if the path to better tournament results runs through emotional balance rather than around it? Before Mrs. Morrison could respond, a familiar voice called Joe's name from across the training floor. He turned to see Marcus Mason approaching, looking different than Joe remembered, less rigid somehow, with the kind of relaxed bearing that suggested personal growth rather than professional defeat. Marcus, Joe said, surprised by his own lack of defensive tension. Naomi mentioned you wanted to speak with me. I did, Marcus replied, his voice carrying none of the hostility Joe had expected. But I can see you're working with a new student. I can wait. Mrs. Morrison looked between the two men with obvious confusion. I'm sorry, but who are you? Marcus Mason, the former instructor replied with a self-deprecating smile. Former head instructor here, current student of humility and perspective. The response was so unexpected that even Joe was caught off guard. The Marcus, he remembered, had been incapable of admitting error or acknowledging limitation. Yet here he stood, making jokes about his own personal growth. Marcus was my predecessor, Joe explained to Mrs. Morrison. An excellent martial artist with years of teaching experience. Was, Marcus corrected quietly. Now I'm trying to figure out how to be a better human being. Joe, when you have a few minutes, I'd like to apologize for some things and maybe ask for some advice. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of running footsteps as Lila burst onto the training floor, her face bright with excitement and something that looked like important news. Daddy, she called, momentarily forgetting the formal protocols of the training environment in her enthusiasm. Mrs. Chen called Trevor got accepted to the special program at the magnet school, and his essay was about how martial arts taught him to help other people instead of just competing with them. Joe felt a warm surge of pride that had nothing to do with his own accomplishments and everything to do with watching his students apply their training to the broader challenges of life. Trevor's transformation from frustrated competitor to supportive teammate had been one of the most rewarding aspects of his teaching experience. That's wonderful news, Joe said, lifting Lila up for a quick hug before setting her down with gentle reminder about appropriate behavior during class time. Sorry, Sensei Walker, Lila said, with exaggerated formality that made several nearby students giggle. I was just excited about Trevor's success. Mrs. Morrison watched this interaction with obvious confusion. Your daughter trains here too. Lila was actually my first student, Joe replied. She's the reason I discovered I wanted to teach again. Alex, who had been quietly observing everything, suddenly spoke up. Your daughter calls you Sensei Walker. All the students do during class time, Lila explained with the seriousness of someone explaining important protocol. It helps maintain the proper, respectful atmosphere. But he's still just Daddy when we go home. The simple statement seemed to resonate with Alex in ways that Joe hadn't expected. The boy's expression shifted as he processed the idea that a teacher could maintain professional authority without sacrificing personal warmth, that respect and affection weren't mutually exclusive. Mrs. Morrison, Joe said, sensing an opportunity to address the woman's deeper concerns. I think Alex would benefit from our program, but I want to be honest about what we offer. We will prepare him for competition if that's what he wants, but we'll do it in a way that preserves his love for the art and his emotional well-being. What exactly does that mean in practical terms? She asked her business-like tone, suggesting she was ready to negotiate specific conditions. It means training that builds confidence rather than anxiety, Joe replied. It means celebrating effort and improvement, not just victories. It means teaching Alex that his worth as a person isn't determined by his tournament results. He gestured toward the students around them, who were continuing their practice with the kind of focused enjoyment that emerged when learning became intrinsically motivated rather than externally driven. Every student here knows they're valued for who they are, not just what they can accomplish. That security allows them to take risks, to push themselves harder, and ultimately to perform better than they would under pressure-based training. Marcus stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. Mrs. Morrison, may I say something? I trained Alex's type of student for years, gifted kids under enormous pressure to succeed. I thought I was helping them by pushing harder, demanding perfection, treating every practice like a life-or-death competition. His voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. What I learned, unfortunately, after making several serious mistakes, is that pressure-based training might produce short-term results, but it ultimately destroys the very qualities that make great martial artists: curiosity, resilience, and genuine love for the art. Mrs. Morrison looked between Marcus and Joe, clearly struggling to reconcile this collaborative conversation with her expectations of competitive business relationships. Are you saying that my approach has been wrong? She asked, her defensive tone suggesting she was already anticipating criticism. I'm saying that your desire for Alex to succeed is absolutely right, Joe replied diplomatically. But there might be more effective ways to support that success than the methods you've been using. Alex, who had been listening to this entire conversation, suddenly spoke up with the clarity that sometimes emerged when children cut through adult complications to reach essential truths. Mom, he said quietly, I want to be good at martial arts, but I also want to enjoy it again, like I used to. The simple statement landed in the conversation like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that reached every adult present. Mrs. Morrison's expression shifted as she looked at her son, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in months. You don't enjoy training anymore? She asked, her voice carrying a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. Alex shrugged with the diplomatic skills of a child who had learned to navigate between honesty and parental expectations. Sometimes, but mostly it feels like work. Like if I don't win, I'm disappointing everyone. Joe watched Mrs. Morrison's face cycle through a series of emotions: surprise guilt, defensive anger, and finally something that looked like recognition. This was the moment that determined whether a parent would double down on failed strategies or find the courage to change course. I thought I was helping you reach your potential, she said softly. You were, Alex replied with mature generosity. But maybe there are different ways to reach potential. The question hung in the air with the weight of possibility and transformation. Joe could feel the conversation balanced on a knife's edge between old patterns and new understanding. Mrs. Morrison, Joe said gently, what if we tried something different? What if Alex trained here for a month and we measured success not just by technique improvement, but by his enjoyment level, his confidence, and his overall relationship with martial arts? And if his competitive performance suffers, she asked, though her tone suggested she was already considering the possibility. Then we'll adjust our approach, Joe promised. But I suspect you'll find that a student who trains with joy and confidence will ultimately perform better than one who trains from fear and pressure. Mrs. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving between Alex's hopeful expression and the students around them who were clearly engaged and enjoying their practice. Finally, she nodded slowly. 1 month, she agreed. We'll try it your way for 1 month. The relief on Alex's face was immediate and unmistakable. For the first time since entering the academy, he looked like a child rather than a small adult carrying the weight of unrealistic expectations. As Mrs. Morrison completed the enrollment paperwork, Marcus approached Joe with the kind of hesitant respect that suggested he was about to venture into uncomfortable territory. "Joe, I owe you an apology," Marcus said without preamble. "Not just for the way I behaved during that confrontation, but for the way I'd been teaching. I was so focused on producing winners that I forgot about developing human beings." Joe felt the tension he'd been carrying for months begin to ease. "Marcus, you don't owe me anything. We just had different approaches to the same goal." "No," Marcus said firmly. "My approach was wrong, and it took losing this position for me to see it clearly. I've been working with a therapist trying to understand why I felt so threatened by your methods, why I couldn't see that what you were offering was better than what I was providing." The admission caught Joe completely off guard. The Marcus he remembered would never have acknowledged error or sought professional help for personal growth. "What did you discover?" Joe asked, genuinely curious about his former colleague's journey. Marcus smiled with the rueful self-awareness of someone who had faced uncomfortable truths about himself. "That my need to produce champions was really about validating my own worth as a teacher and as a person. I was using my students' achievements to prove something about myself, which meant I couldn't see them as individuals with their own needs and goals." He gestured toward the training floor where Alex was now practicing basic techniques alongside other beginners, his face showing the kind of concentrated enjoyment that had been missing from his earlier demonstrations. "That kid right there, he's exactly the type of student I would have pushed too hard, demanded too much from, ultimately driven away from the art entirely. Because I would have seen his potential and wanted to claim credit for developing it." Joe nodded, understanding the psychological trap that Marcus was describing. "It's easy to lose sight of the students when you're focused on the outcomes." "Exactly," Marcus agreed. "So I wanted to ask you something, and please feel free to say no if it's inappropriate. I'm starting a small program at the community center, working with kids who can't afford private academy tuition. Would you be willing to consult with me occasionally? Help me learn how to teach the way you do." The request was so unexpected that Joe needed a moment to process it fully. Marcus wasn't just apologizing, he was asking to learn from the man he'd once dismissed as unqualified. "Marcus, I'd be honored to help," Joe replied. "But you should know that I'm still learning too. Every day, every student teaches me something new about what it means to be an effective instructor." "That's exactly why I want to learn from you," Marcus said with a laugh. "The fact that you're still open to learning, still questioning your own methods, that's what makes you a real teacher, instead of just someone who knows techniques." As their conversation continued, Joe became aware of a shift in the academy's atmosphere. Parents who had arrived for pickup were lingering longer than usual, drawn into conversations with their children about the day's training. Students were demonstrating techniques for siblings and friends, sharing their enthusiasm for the art in ways that extended beyond formal class time. This was what Joe had hoped for when he'd first accepted Naomi's offer, not just technical instruction, but the cultivation of a community where martial arts became a shared language for discussing larger questions of character resilience and mutual support. "Daddy," Lila's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mrs. Park wanted to ask you something." Joe turned to see Anna Park approaching with David, whose transformation over the past 3 months had been one of the most dramatic he'd witnessed. The quiet, uncertain boy who had been thrown by Marcus was now one of the academy's most dedicated students, his technical skills improving steadily alongside his growing confidence. "Mr. Walker." Anna said, her voice carrying the emotion of a parent who had watched her child blossom under good instruction. "David has something he wants to ask you." David stepped forward with the kind of nervous determination that Joe recognized from students who were about to attempt something challenging and important. "Sensei Walker," David said formally, "I've been practicing really hard, and Mrs. Sinclair said I might be ready to test for my next belt rank. Would you be willing to be my testing instructor?" The question hit Joe with unexpected emotional force. Belt testing was one of the most important milestones in a student's development, a formal recognition of growth and achievement that carried deep symbolic meaning. For David to request Joe as his testing instructor was both an honor and a responsibility that spoke to the trust the boy had developed in his teacher. "David, I would be honored to conduct your test," Joe replied, his voice slightly thick with emotion. "When do you think you'll be ready?" "I want to wait until Alex is ready too," David said, glancing toward the new student, who was still working through basic techniques. "He seems nervous, and I thought maybe if we tested together, it might be easier for him." The generous impulse caught Joe off guard. Here was a student who had been bullied and diminished, now thinking about how to support someone else who was struggling. This was character development in action, the transformation of personal growth into service to others. "That's very thoughtful, David," Joe said. "How do you think Alex would feel about that suggestion?" David looked across the training floor to where Alex was practicing with visible concentration, his earlier anxiety replaced by the kind of focused effort that emerged when students felt safe to make mistakes and learn from them. "I think he'd like having a friend to test with," David said, with the wisdom of someone who remembered what it felt like to face challenges alone. "And maybe I could help him with some of the techniques he's still learning." Joe felt a profound sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with technical instruction and everything to do with watching his students develop the qualities of leadership and compassion that would serve them throughout their lives. "David, would you like to be Alex's training partner for the next few weeks?" Joe asked. "You could help him learn our academy's specific requirements while practicing for your own test." The boy's face lit up with the kind of enthusiasm that demonstrated how deeply he had internalized the lesson that teaching others was one of the best ways to deepen your own understanding. "Yes, sir," David replied, then immediately headed toward Alex to extend the invitation, watching the two boys work together. David patient and encouraging Alex, grateful and focused. Joe felt the kind of deep satisfaction that came from seeing his educational philosophy translated into real-world behavior. These weren't just students learning techniques. They were young people developing the character traits that would make them better friends, family members, and citizens. "Joe," Naomi's voice called from across the training floor, "could I speak with you for a moment?" He excused himself from the various conversations and approached Naomi, who was holding what appeared to be an official-looking letter. "This came in today's mail," she said, her expression mixing excitement with something that looked like apprehension. "The Regional Board of Martial Arts Schools wants to nominate our academy for the Excellence in Youth Development Award. It's based on our innovative approach to character-based instruction." Joe stared at the letter, struggling to process the implications. Recognition from the regional board would mean increased enrollment, enhanced reputation, validation of his teaching methods on a professional level. "That's incredible," he said slowly, "but also terrifying. What if we can't live up to that kind of recognition?" Naomi smiled with the confidence of someone who had watched transformation happen daily for months. "Joe, look around. Look at what you've built here." David helping Alex, Stephanie mentoring younger students, Trevor writing essays about cooperation instead of competition. This isn't just excellent youth development. This is revolutionary youth development. As Joe surveyed the training floor, he saw the evidence of what Naomi was describing. Students of different skill levels working together. Parents engaging in meaningful conversations about their children's growth. An atmosphere of mutual support that extended far beyond technical instruction. But what moved him most was the sight of Lila demonstrating a technique to a group of younger students, her movements precise and confident, her explanations patient and clear. The little girl who had once pressed her face against the glass door, longing to belong, was now a leader helping others find their own sense of belonging. "Daddy," Lila called out suddenly. "Could you come help us with something?" Joe approached the group of younger students who were attempting a particularly challenging combination with varying degrees of success. Their faces showed the kind of focused frustration that emerged when students were pushing against the edges of their current ability. "What seems to be the problem?" Joe asked. "The jumping kick is really hard," complained a 6-year-old named Sophia. "I keep landing wrong and it doesn't look like the older kids' kicks." Joe knelt down to Sophia's eye level, recognizing the familiar challenge of helping students understand that growth was a process rather than an immediate transformation. "Sophia, how long do you think Lila has been practicing that kick?" he asked. The little girl considered the question seriously. "A really long time. About 6 months," Lila answered. "And I still don't do it perfectly every time." "The secret," Joe explained to the group, "isn't to do it perfectly right away. The secret is to do it a little bit better each time you practice. Can you show me your best attempt, Sophia?" The little girl nodded seriously and executed the technique with obvious effort. Her form was far from perfect, but Joe could see the foundation of good technique beginning to emerge. "Excellent," Joe said with genuine enthusiasm. "I can see that you understand the basic timing, and your balance is much better than most students when they first learn this kick. What do you think you could work on to make it even better?" Sophia's face scrunched with concentration. "Maybe land more softly." "Perfect observation," Joe confirmed. "Lila, would you show Sophia how you practice landing softly?" As Lila demonstrated the technique breakdown she'd been taught, Joe watched the younger students absorb not just the technical instruction, but the modeling of patient, supportive teaching. This was how character development spread through a community, not through lectures or rules, but through consistent examples of how people could treat each other with respect and kindness. The evening class was winding down, but Joe noticed that families were lingering longer than usual, drawn into the kind of meaningful conversations that emerged when children were excited about sharing their learning experiences. Mrs. Morrison approached with Alex, whose earlier anxiety had been completely replaced by obvious enthusiasm. "Mr. Walker," she said, her tone markedly different from their earlier conversation. "Alex has been telling me about his new training partner and about the breathing techniques you taught him. I have to admit, I haven't seen him this excited about martial arts in months." Joe looked down at Alex, who was practically bouncing with energy despite the intensity of his first training session. "How did it feel, Alex?" Joe asked. "Like martial arts again," the boy replied with simple honesty. "Not like work or pressure or trying not to disappoint people. Just like learning something beautiful and getting stronger at the same time." Mrs. Morrison's expression shifted as she processed her son's words. "I think I've been so focused on his potential that I forgot about his happiness." "The beautiful thing about martial arts," Joe said gently, "is that happiness and potential usually support each other. Students who enjoy their training tend to work harder, take more risks, and ultimately achieve more than those who are driven by external pressure." As more families departed, calling out thanks and confirmations for the next week's classes, Joe found himself alone on the training floor with Lila and Naomi. The space felt different in the quiet aftermath of intense activity, peaceful somehow, but also charged with the residual energy of meaningful work accomplished. "Daddy," Lila said, settling beside him on the mat. "Do you remember when you were scared that we didn't belong here?" Joe laughed, thinking back to those early days of uncertainty and fear. "I remember being terrified that I wasn't good enough to teach these kids, that their parents would see right through me and realize I was just a janitor pretending to be an instructor." "But you were never just a janitor," Lila replied with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes displayed. "You were always a teacher. You just needed the right place to remember it." The observation hit Joe with the force of profound truth. He thought about his journey from desperate single father to confident instructor, about the way necessity had forced him to rediscover strengths he'd buried under years of survival-focused living. "You know what I learned, baby girl," Joe said, pulling Lila close. "I learned that who you are isn't determined by what job you have, or how much money you make, or what other people think about you. Who you are is determined by how you treat people, especially when no one is watching, and there's nothing in it for you." Naomi, who had been quietly organizing equipment, looked up with obvious emotion. "Joe, that's exactly the lesson every one of these children needed to learn. You didn't just teach them martial arts, you taught them how to be better human beings." As they prepared to leave the academy for the evening, Joe took one last look around the training floor where his life had been transformed. The mirrors reflected not just his physical image, but the journey from invisibility to significance, from desperation to purpose, from survival to service. 6 months ago, he had pushed a mop across these floors, invisible to the families, whose children now looked up to him as a mentor and guide. The transformation seemed impossible in retrospect, like a story too convenient to be true. But the reality was more complex and more beautiful than any fairy tale. Joe's success hadn't come from magical intervention or sudden revelation. It had emerged from the patient accumulation of small choices, daily commitments to showing up and doing his best regardless of recognition or reward. "Daddy," Lila said, as they walked toward the parking lot. "Mrs. Chen told me that Trevor is going to write about you for his high school application essay, about how you taught him that helping other people was more important than beating them." Joe felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with personal recognition and everything to do with the ripple effects of intentional teaching. Trevor would carry those lessons into high school, college, and whatever career he ultimately chose. He would treat colleagues with respect, help struggling teammates improve, and approach competition as an opportunity for mutual growth rather than zero-sum domination. "You know what the best part is?" Joe said, as they reached their car, the same old Honda they'd been driving for years, but which now felt like a chariot carrying them toward an exciting future rather than a barely functional escape from creditors. "What?" Lila asked. "Tomorrow we get to do it all again. New students to meet new techniques, to explore new opportunities, to help kids discover what they're capable of becoming." As they drove home through the familiar streets of their neighborhood, Joe thought about Marcus working with underprivileged kids at the community center, about Alex rediscovering his love for martial arts, about David developing the confidence to help others learn. Each of these stories represented not just individual transformation, but the expansion of positive influence into areas he might never directly reach. This was the true measure of successful teaching, not the trophies won or the techniques mastered, but the character developed and shared, the ripple effects of patient guidance extending far beyond any single classroom or training session. At home, as Lila practiced her forms in the living room, with the kind of joyful concentration that made technique look like dance, Joe found himself thinking about the letter from the regional board. Recognition was gratifying, but what mattered more was the knowledge that dozens of children were learning to see strength as something they could develop, confidence as something they could earn, and success as something they could define for themselves. The janitor, who had once felt invisible, had discovered that true visibility came not from being seen by others, but from helping others see themselves more clearly. And in that discovery, he had found not just a career, but a calling that would sustain and challenge him for years to come. Looking out the window at the neighborhood where he and Lila had learned to rebuild their lives from nothing, Joe Walker smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found his place in the world, not by changing who he was, but by finally becoming who he had always been meant to be.